In our world, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, a final blow delivered by the rising power of the Ottoman Turks under Sultan Mehmed II. But in this alternate timeline, history turned on a single moment of uncertainty. The siege did not succeed. As the Ottoman armies camped before the mighty Theodosian walls, a storm surged in the Bosporus. Several Ottoman ships were destroyed, while Venetian reinforcements, unexpected and unusually well-timed, broke through the Ottoman blockade. With them came critical supplies, cannons, and trained artillery crews. Inside the city, morale soared. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, still weary but resolved, refused to surrender. The fighting lasted longer than in our history. After a month of brutal assaults and heavy losses, Mehmed's campaign faltered. His janissaries grew restless. His advisors feared plague, desertion, and the loss of prestige. Eventually, the Ottoman army withdrew, defeated, not crushed, but stalled. Constantinople still stood. The failed siege had wider consequences. Mehmed's aura of invincibility was broken. Across Anatolia, Turkish beyliks that had once submitted to the Ottomans began resisting again. The Karamanids, in particular, saw an opportunity to reassert their independence. Meanwhile, Christian Europe, shocked by the unexpected survival of the Byzantine capital, began to reframe its perception of the sickly empire in the East. The papacy, sensing a shift in the balance of power, renewed its calls for a united Christian defense of the East. In 1455, a new alliance was formed, uneasy, tentative, but real. Venice, Genoa, Aragon, and even Hungary pledged limited support to Constantinople in exchange for trade privileges and political influence. Though many Western leaders remained wary of Eastern Orthodoxy, survival of a common Christian bastion now overrode theological divisions. Within Constantinople, Constantine XI ruled with newfound authority. The city was still damaged, its population reduced, its institutions fragile, but it had survived the unthinkable. The emperor began a campaign of modest reforms. He invited displaced Greek scholars to return from Italy. Fortifications were rebuilt. Trade laws were revised to favor allies. Most importantly, the emperor commissioned the reorganization of the army, not vast in size, but disciplined, professional, and well-equipped. The Byzantine Church, long weakened by internal schisms, regained its footing. The failed Ottoman siege was interpreted by many as divine intervention. Pilgrims returned, monasteries reopened, frescoes and icons once hidden or defaced were restored. For a brief moment, hope returned to a city long thought doomed. Meanwhile, the Ottomans turned inward. Mehmed blamed treachery among his generals for the defeat. Purges followed. A new campaign was planned, but with growing instability on the Anatolian frontier, the Sultan's attention was divided. He would never again fully commit to Constantinople. In the West, news of the city's survival inspired both awe and anxiety. Humanist scholars in Italy, already enthralled by Greek texts and ideas, now saw Byzantium not only as a memory, but as a living link to classical antiquity. The Renaissance, still in full bloom, began to absorb Byzantine artistic and architectural influences more directly. By the early 1460s, Constantinople had stabilized. It was no longer the capital of a vast empire, but it was no longer a relic either. Instead, it became something else, a survivor state, an unlikely stubborn remnant of Rome's Eastern legacy. And as the rest of Europe drifted toward new discoveries, new empires, and new wars, the Byzantines watched, cautious but resolute, behind their rebuilt walls, aware that history had given them a second chance. What they would do with it remained to be seen. By the late 1460s, the city of Constantinople had shifted from a crumbling fortress into a quiet center of recovery. Its people had endured siege, hunger, and political despair. But now, in the shadow of survival, something remarkable began to take root. Not military revival, nor imperial ambition, but a cultural awakening. Though diminished in territory, the Byzantine Empire was rich in something far more lasting: memory. Its libraries, monasteries, and scholars held centuries of Greek philosophy, Roman legal theory, early Christian theology, and ancient scientific writings. While much of Europe still discovered classical ideas through translations and fragments, Byzantium had never lost them. They had simply gone quiet, waiting. The Emperor Constantine XI, nearing the end of his reign, established a new institution, the Palaiologan Academy. Housed in a refurbished palace overlooking the Golden Horn, the Academy gathered theologians, astronomers, architects, poets, and scribes. The goal was not military planning, but preservation and expansion of knowledge. The city became a haven for Greek scholars returning from Italy, now joined by curious Western humanists seeking access to original manuscripts. This intellectual flowering spread gradually across the eastern Mediterranean. Thessaloniki, once neglected, was revived as a provincial capital of culture. Monasteries on Mount Athos received patronage again. The city of Trebizond, still independent on the Black Sea coast, aligned itself more closely with Constantinople, sending its artists and philosophers to study at the Academy. One of the most celebrated figures of this revival was Ioannis Kritaboulos, a historian and former diplomat who documented the failed Ottoman siege in vivid prose. His writings reframed the survival of Constantinople not as a mere accident of war, but as the continuation of a divine mission, the preservation of Orthodox civilization and the legacy of Rome. Byzantine architecture, long stalled under the weight of economic decline, also experienced rebirth. Churches damaged during the siege were not just repaired, but redesigned. A new generation of architects fused classical columns with domes of daring complexity, creating sanctuaries filled with light, mosaics, and silence. One such project, the Church of St. Constantine Renewed, stood as a symbol of endurance, modern, yet unmistakably Byzantine. Politically, the empire remained cautious. Its borders did not expand significantly, and it relied heavily on diplomacy. Treaties with Venice and Genoa secured maritime trade. A carefully negotiated agreement with Hungary prevented conflict in the Balkans. In Anatolia, the Karamanids became unofficial allies, creating a buffer against renewed Ottoman aggression. The Ottomans themselves were now entangled in their own struggles. After Mehmed's death in 1481, his successors faced internal revolts, religious dissension, and pressure from eastern neighbors. Without the symbolic victory of Constantinople, the Ottomans lost some of their momentum. They remained a powerful force, but no longer inevitable. In the West, this stability created unexpected consequences. The continued existence of Byzantium weakened the narrative of a world divided purely between Catholic and Protestant forces. As Europe lurched into the Reformation, some thinkers looked eastward, not for military help, but for spiritual clarity. A few radical reformers even corresponded with Orthodox bishops, curious about their doctrines and practices. This didn't lead to unity, but it introduced nuance. In Wittenberg, in Geneva, in Rome, Byzantium was no longer just a symbol of decline, but a living system of belief, thought, and order. By the dawn of the 16th century, Constantinople had become something unusual, not the heart of an empire, but a mind, a place where memory was valued above might, where art, language, and theology evolved not for conquest, but for contemplation. The city still bore its scars. Some quarters remained in ruin. The population was smaller than in the days of Justinian or Basil, but its influence had begun to radiate, slowly, subtly, like light from an oil lamp in a darkened hall. And the world began cautiously to notice. As the 16th century unfolded, the Byzantine Empire found itself walking a narrow path between giants. To the west, the powerful kingdoms of Spain, France, and the Habsburg Empire vied for dominance over a splintered Europe. To the east, the Ottomans, though no longer unstoppable, remained formidable, rebuilding their strength under a more cautious and bureaucratic sultanate. And in the north, the rising star of Muscovy began to cast a long shadow. For the Byzantines, survival had never meant domination. It meant diplomacy. Constantinople, once a city of swords and legions, had now become a city of parchment and negotiation. Ambassadors from every major power passed through its gates. Some came to observe, others to influence, and a few simply to listen. Under Emperor Alexios VI, a scholarly and cautious ruler, descended from Constantine XI, Byzantium took on the role of broker and buffer. The empire could not afford war, not militarily nor economically, but it could afford leverage, control of key trade routes, deep cultural capital, and a reputation for reliability made the empire more useful alive than conquered. One of the defining achievements of this era was the Concord of the Bosporus, a series of agreements signed between 1527 and 1533 that regulated access to the Black Sea, guaranteed freedom of navigation for multiple Christian states, and limited Ottoman naval presence beyond the Dardanelles. The Ottomans, focused on internal stability and wary of Venetian interference, reluctantly agreed. The Concord did not end rivalry, but it ensured predictability. Inside the empire, society continued to evolve. The Palaiologan Academy expanded into a broader university system, with new branches in Thessaloniki and Trebizond. A generation of scholars emerged who had never known siege or decline, only peace, tradition, and curiosity. Texts were translated into both Latin and Slavonic, and the empire became a kind of crossroads between East and West, Orthodox and Catholic, Old and New. Culturally, Byzantium began to influence beyond its borders again. Orthodox art, with its rich iconography and complex symbolism, became fashionable among certain Western courts. Polish and Hungarian churches adopted Byzantine mosaics. Russian princes, eager to present themselves as rightful heirs of Eastern Christian tradition, began to imitate the architectural and ceremonial grandeur of Constantinople. But this imitation brought tension. In Moscow, Grand Prince Ivan IV, soon to be crowned Tsar, declared that Russia was the Third Rome, successor to both ancient Rome and Constantinople. He claimed religious and imperial authority not just within Russia, but over the entire Orthodox world. His envoys demanded recognition from Constantinople's patriarch. The Byzantines refused. For them, Moscow was a partner, not a master. The idea of a third Rome was seen as both flattering and dangerous. Constantinople had survived not to be replaced, but to continue. The imperial court responded with subtle diplomacy, sending gifts, flattery, even honorary titles, but never submission. This religious rivalry planted seeds of future conflict, but for now, the two powers maintained an uneasy respect. Russian pilgrims continued to visit the Holy Land through Byzantine territory. Byzantine theologians traveled to Moscow to debate doctrine, but always, beneath the surface, the question lingered: who would lead the Orthodox world into the future? Meanwhile, in the West, the Protestant Reformation erupted with full force. Martin Luther's writings shook the Catholic Church to its core. While Catholic and Protestant states clashed, many thinkers began to look eastward for examples of Christian governance outside papal authority. Constantinople, once distant and exotic, now seemed almost relevant. Byzantine envoys were invited to councils and theological debates. Some Orthodox teachings, like the concept of conciliar governance, shared leadership among bishops, found sympathetic ears among reformers. Though few conversions occurred, the intellectual exchange was real. By the mid-16th century, the Byzantine Empire was no longer seen as dying or irrelevant. It was, in its own way, modern, a small, resilient state guided by diplomacy, culture, and restraint. It had not conquered, but it had endured. And in a century marked by religious war, colonial ambition, and technological change, endurance was no small thing. By the late 1500s, the Byzantine Empire had become a strange paradox in the heart of a turbulent world. It was small but stable, ancient but forward-looking, devout but diplomatic. While mighty empires rose and fell around it, Byzantium remained, a thread of memory woven through the chaotic fabric of the modern age. The 17th century brought change not through conquest, but through connection. Trade flourished across the eastern Mediterranean. Greek-speaking merchants, long marginalized, became vital intermediaries between East and West. Their ships sailed from Constantinople to Alexandria, from Smyrna to Venice, carrying goods, stories, and ideas. The empire itself had shrunk in geography but grown in influence. With much of Anatolia still controlled by the Ottomans, and the Balkans divided between Catholic kingdoms and Slavic principalities, Constantinople functioned less like the capital of an empire and more like the heart of a network, a cultural and religious capital without direct rule, but with moral gravity. This gravity was strongest in the Orthodox world. Despite tensions with Moscow, the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople remained the symbolic leader of global orthodoxy. Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and even Wallachian churches looked to the city not just for rites and rituals, but for continuity. While Russia grew more autocratic under the Romanovs, Byzantium represented a different path, a Christianity tied to tradition, but not to total power. Still, the empire was not without problems. Internal debates over reform simmered. Some factions, especially among younger aristocrats and scholars, argued for modernization. A written constitution, greater secular authority, and formal universities modeled after those in Paris and Leiden. Others insisted that Byzantium's strength came from its stability, its monarchy, and its religious foundation. These arguments remained mostly peaceful, but increasingly sharp. Meanwhile, the world changed rapidly. The printing press, though initially viewed with suspicion, was finally accepted and integrated by the early 1600s. The first Greek-language printing house in Constantinople began operating in 1609, producing religious texts, legal codes, and eventually poetry and philosophical treatises. Literacy rates among urban populations rose, particularly in Thessaloniki and Trebizond. Western travelers who visited the empire often returned with surprising reports, not of decline, but of quiet refinement. They described candlelit libraries, open-air marketplaces, and schools where Plato and the Church Fathers were studied side by side. The city's famed Hagia Sophia, restored and maintained with meticulous care, was no longer seen as a relic of a fallen civilization, but as a beacon of one that had endured. This endurance inspired others. In 1643, the Dutch philosopher and diplomat Nicholas van Ried visited Constantinople and later wrote, "It is as though a memory survived and learned to speak again, not loudly, but clearly. The Romans are not dead. They have simply changed their voice." But Byzantium was not immune to danger. In 1667, an earthquake struck the Sea of Marmara, damaging parts of the city and collapsing sections of the ancient land walls. Though quickly repaired, the event exposed deeper weaknesses, aging infrastructure, over-reliance on a few wealthy trading families, and a shrinking rural population. The empire's success in avoiding war had preserved its cities, but also discouraged military innovation. Its army was modest, disciplined, but outdated. This vulnerability did not go unnoticed. In 1675, a new Ottoman sultan, more ambitious than his predecessors, began making demands, tributes, trade concessions, and the removal of Karamanid envoys from the Byzantine court. Tensions rose, but war did not come. Instead, a coalition of Venice, Las Austria, and Poland-Lithuania intervened diplomatically, warning the Ottomans against aggression. Byzantium, once the object of rescue, was now the reason coalitions formed. This shift marked a subtle but significant change in European perception. The Byzantine Empire, long thought irrelevant, had become a litmus test. If it could survive, could old traditions coexist with modernity? If Constantinople could endure, what did that say about the foundations of empire? In this era, Byzantium also began to participate, quietly, in the scientific revolution. While it lacked the resources of France or England, it offered safe haven to thinkers fleeing persecution. Astronomers from Italy, chemists from Bohemia, and political theorists from the Netherlands passed through the city. Some stayed, finding patronage in quiet monasteries or within the academy's stone courtyards. Their presence influenced a new generation of Byzantine scholars who began to question, gently but persistently, what is truth without freedom? Can faith and reason walk the same path? By 1700, the empire stood at a crossroads, not one of invasion or collapse, but of identity. It had survived against odds, adapted to modern pressures, and played a careful game of neutrality and culture. But endurance alone could not last forever. Soon, the world would ask a different question, not whether Byzantium could survive, but whether it could lead. The 18th century arrived not with conquest, but with questions. For the Byzantine Empire, reduced, reimagined, and remarkably enduring, the world was no longer filled with enemies at its gates. The Ottomans were in slow decline, their reach still vast but their momentum broken. Western Europe had surged into the Age of Enlightenment, a revolution of thought and science. And across the Atlantic, whispers of a new world and new republics reached even the marble halls of Constantinople. But for Byzantium, the choice was not whether to embrace change, it was how. Emperor Andreas III, a philosopher-emperor schooled in both theology and astronomy, ascended the throne in 1724. Unlike his predecessors, he did not see the West as a threat, nor orthodoxy as incompatible with progress. Under his reign, the empire entered a final, quiet golden age, less defined by expansion and more by illumination. The Palaiologan Academy evolved into the Imperial University of Constantinople. Courses in logic, medicine, and mathematics were taught alongside scripture and classical philosophy. The works of Descartes, Newton, and Locke were translated into Greek. Students came not only from Byzantine provinces, but from Wallachia, Georgia, and even parts of the Holy Roman Empire. It was, at least briefly, a true intellectual crossroads. Politically, Andreas pursued cautious liberalization. The emperor introduced a council of advisors selected from noble families, clergy, and merchants. It had no legislative power, but its existence marked a symbolic step toward consultation over decree. Local administrators gained more autonomy. Urban guilds received charters. The empire's bureaucracy, long rigid and archaic, was gently reformed. The Orthodox Church remained a pillar of society, but its role was reshaped. While monasteries retained spiritual authority, the emperor limited their political power. Education was moved under secular supervision. The patriarchate initially resisted, but a new generation of bishops, educated alongside scholars, saw the benefit of cooperation. Theology began to echo with scientific metaphor. Icons were painted with anatomical precision. Faith did not diminish, it adapted. Outside its borders, the world shifted again. The American colonies declared independence. France convulsed in revolution. The old orders of Europe began to tremble. And through it all, Constantinople remained strangely still. That stillness was not stagnation. It was endurance. In 1701, as Napoleon marched through Egypt and plotted campaigns in the east, he sent a letter to the Emperor of Byzantium. In it, he praised the eternal city of Constantine and proposed an alliance of convenience. The emperor refused, courteously, firmly. Byzantium had survived too long by avoiding entanglement in Western ambitions. Yet the empire could not isolate itself forever. By the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution had redrawn the balance of power. Steamships replaced sails, railroads crisscrossed Europe, telegraph lines made borders more porous. The empire, unable to keep pace with the technological leap, began to lose influence. Trade declined. Its military, still ceremonial in many ways, could not compete with the mechanized forces of France, Britain, or even Russia. And so, the empire did what it had always done. It adapted. Rather than industrialize from within, it opened itself. Joint ventures with Western powers modernized ports and arsenals. German engineers advised on infrastructure. British banks funded rail projects to Thessaloniki and Trebizond. In return, Byzantium offered stability, access, and neutrality in a region that still simmered with rivalries. By the turn of the 20th century, the Byzantine Empire was no longer an empire in the traditional sense. Its borders remained modest. Parts of Thrace, coastal Macedonia, islands of the Aegean, and the fortified jewel of Constantinople. But it remained sovereign, proud, and intact. Its identity had shifted. No longer heirs to Rome in conquest, they were heirs in culture, memory, and moral presence. The city's domes and mosaics inspired generations of artists. Its theological archives influenced debates across the Christian world. Its survival had become a story that others leaned on, a reminder that resilience could outlast revolution. In 1914, when the Great War erupted across Europe, the Byzantine Empire declared neutrality. Its ports housed refugees. Its hospitals treated wounded soldiers, regardless of allegiance. When the war ended, the empire stood largely untouched, scarred only by time, not by artillery. And in the 21st century, the Empire of the Romans, as it still officially called itself, remained a constitutional monarchy. Small, influential, fiercely traditional. The Hagia Sophia still echoed with prayer. The Imperial University remained one of the oldest active centers of learning on Earth. The streets of Constantinople, still bearing that name, buzzed with languages, lanterns, and the slow rhythm of a state that had never stopped breathing. The Ottomans had vanished. The Soviet Union had risen and fallen. Borders had changed 100 times. But Byzantium had endured. It had not won wars. It had not ruled continents. But it had survived the impossible. And in that survival, it had shaped the world more subtly, like an ancient melody carried softly on the wind, long after the drumbeats of empire had gone silent.